Okay, I'm a little late with this one. Summer has come and gone, and it's almost October. It's time for spoopy things and scary video games. But I couldn't let the summer of 0451 end with just 2 individual titles, and Prey is kind of a spooky game, at least in part. So let's wrap this thing up with one last 0451 title. Let's take a look at Prey. The easiest way to talk about Prey, I think, will be to break it down into what I feel are the 3 big chunks it seems to have. They're not really 3 acts, it isn't really broken down by narrative, and it's not even specific levels, but more just phases of how cohesive the game is and what it's trying to accomplish. And they don't really have distinct beginnings and endings, but all kind of blur into one another, the successes and failures of each bit bleeding over but fading away. The first phase I'd like to look at with Prey, and by far the most successful, is the game's opening. I honestly can't remember the last time a game opened up this strong right out the gate. I hate summarizing game plot, but I kind of feel like it's necessary to convey how this bit works. So after picking Morgan's gender, you awaken in your home on the Ides of March. There's that 0451 pseudo-literary thing popping up, and take your private helicopter to work in the building across town. Here you meet your brother Alex, and you do some brief psychological and physiological tests as part of your training in preparation to become an astronaut.
I'd like you to remove the boxes from the red circle as quickly as you can. Just go with your gut. Okay? Wonderful. Press the red button when you're ready.
At some point, things go wrong. Something attacks one of the scientists monitoring you, you pass out, and when you wake back up...
Good morning, Morgan. Today is Monday, March 15th, 2032.
It's the Ides of March, and again you're being asked to go to work. But something's wrong. Not only are you repeating the same day as before, but you're locked in your apartment room, and the only way out is to shatter the window on your high-rise porch. Except when you do, the glass doesn't shatter, the reality presented by the glass does. Suddenly you find yourself in a completely new space. Your entire ride to work, the arrival at the TranStar office, and the testing lab are all shown to be an elaborate hologram and a series of sets that fold in on themselves. The opening of the game is revealed to be an illusion, an artificial space that existed just to test you, and despite the imaginary nature of the world it presented, it clearly hoped to divine some real truths about Morgan's behavior. This feeds into the other thematic conceit that Prey brings up early. We learn in Morgan's office that the fancy hologram used in the opening of the game is called Looking Glass, and I think there's a lot to unpack with that metaphor. I would argue it's not just a nod to the progenitors of the whole 0451 subgenre, though it certainly is that. There's also the Alice in Wonderland connotation, which links looking glasses to portals to another world, often a fantastical world created by the imagination and idle dreaming. And then there's the fact that real looking glasses are mirrors, a way to see ourselves reflected back at us. All of these contexts combine to paint this looking glass technology as a 2D window one looks into to see a 3D space that doesn't exist, but is somehow believable even if the illusion is easily shattered. That it does so as you, the player, are staring at a 2D screen presenting a pretend 3D reality that is, on some superficial level, believable to you in the moment makes this, frankly, a wonderful metaphor for games. And that's further expanded on by Prey's seeming love for 0451 games. Like, most 0451 games feel like they're fans of the subgenre and are aware of the tropes, but Prey feels like it was built as a temple to those titles. It's got all the standard concepts we've talked about a bunch this summer, the one who sees all and is at the core of the problem in your brother Alex, the 0451 code being used early on as the key to Morgan's office, the fantastical setting after a disaster, the immersive sim focus on solving problems your way. But unlike other games that take that concept generally and then jump it forward or move with it in their own direction, Prey spends most of its time looking back. The aesthetics of the whole game are basically System Shock 2 by way of BioShock's Art Deco design. It has a character named Danielle Sho, a reference to System Shock's Shodan.
Was it as insincere as a Danielle Sho apology? No.
They take the abrupt flashes that hint at the twist from BioShock more or less directly.
You better do something. The reconstruction is destabilizing.
They're lying to you.
Hurry.
Arguably, the 6 degrees of freedom you get in space mirror those that you got in System Shock 1's cyberspace minigame. And hey, System Shock 2's grav shafts are back. It takes System Shock 2's inventory management, Bioshock's enemy research mechanic and passive tonic systems, and adds in a smattering of Dishonored-style stealth, and some Deus Ex-style emergent play thrown in with the glue gun's multifunctional uses, emulating stuff like lamb climbing, combat status effects, and environmental manipulation. One almost gets the sense that this game doesn't just want to be an 0451 game, but perhaps the next Shock franchise. While I have absolutely no evidence to support this and no one should take this as verbatim, it's hard to escape the feeling that this game's working title wasn't Psychoshock, where System Shock asked players to transcend themselves through circuitry and cybernetic implants and, well, computer systems, and where Bioshock asked players to use genetic engineering to rewrite their biology, Prey asks you to gain power by injecting thoughts and memories into your brain through neuromods. So, Psychoshock, a shock to the psyche, just like Bioshock is a shock to your biology, and System Shock is a shock to your system. Also, there's a power in the game actually called Psychoshock, so it's not like I'm pulling this connection out of thin air. That said, I think branding a game in 2017 Psychoshock is a hard sell to people not familiar with the whole lineage thing, and most would just think of electric shock therapy, and yeah, there's a reason they didn't name Prey that. Anyways, the game is seeped in the iconography, structure, and references to 0451's history, particularly System Shock and Bioshock. And when you combine that with the looking glass metaphor and the trick opening about tests in a fake world, the opening of Prey is frankly an amazing setup thematically, suggesting that games, particularly 0451 games, and likely this very game, are inherently untrustworthy and designed to test you in ways that search for a truth. But whose truth? What truth can be found in pretend worlds, and what truths have these games been after all along? The opening of the game also sets up tone, and there's a real effort to keep it in line with the other two games it's clearly inspired by, System Shock 2 and Bioshock, that tone being creepy, survival horror-ish, but not too much so. Foreboding and tense rather than scary proper. This is achieved primarily by having the first enemy in the game, Mimics, be able to take the shape of any small trash item laying around. You never know when you enter a room whether one is just going to be waiting to jump out at you. This turns the early game into a sort of single-player prop hunt. With an appropriate jump scare sting every time one decides to attack you. And it's definitely the game's most memorable gameplay mechanic. There's something about seeing a cup of coffee twitch out of the corner of your eye and not being sure if you imagined it or not. Mimic combat is combined with more traditional combat against larger enemies, though it's surprisingly lethal even on easier difficulty settings. Prey more or less requires players to plan encounters ahead of time to either slow, sneak around, or trap enemies. Direct confrontation is possible, but it is expensive, and in a game so much about resource management, that's a big deal. And because you die so easily, and because you're always watching your resource reserves, especially early in the game, it only ratchets up the general sense of tension. Okay, so the opening of the game gives us our thematic and tonal baselines. What's the next big chunk of Prey? Well, there's sort of a long haul in the middle that focuses on meat and potatoes gameplay for a while. The thematic stuff cools off for several hours outside of one or two clever references. The D&D game the crew is playing being a window into their characters is a nice one.
We don't have much choice. Elias? Sorry, Stabfellow?
Captain Stabfellow! Can I answer her?
Hell no! You hear nothing from the darkness. It has swallowed Stabfellow completely.
Really though, this segment is basically a series of various 0451 showpieces. Some skew closer to System Shock 2, like the crew quarters where you're reading lots of audio dialogues of the dead and finding their entire stories there. Some skew closer to Deus Ex with live NPCs and role-playing-ish decisions, like the bit where you need to put 3 turrets in front of the door in the cargo bay and can do so any number of ways, but if you use your Typhon powers in front of the humans, they may shoot you.
There's something over here. I'm going to take a look over here.
Die already!
Others kind of lend themselves to a bit of stealth, like the opening to Deep Storage when Alex locks you in and you likely haven't restocked ammo lately. They're all engaging to play through in their own way, and while they don't feel as cohesive mechanically as, say, Dishonored 2's varied levels that each have their own gimmick, they're perfectly fine immersive sim bits. They just don't do a ton thematically or even plot-wise. This whole middle chunk's plot is either self-contained vignettes, or the overall fetch quest to get both of the arming keys for the self-destruct mechanism. To put it nicely, it is lovingly crafted, super expensive looking, brilliantly designed, quite enjoyable to play filler. It's not bad, in fact it's probably the whole reason you're here playing the game, for this very immersive semi-0451 stuff, but it's just not in service to anything greater. Where the opening few hours are all about setting theme and tone with a shocking twist and a great plot hook or mechanical idea, this bit feels comfortable just toying with the established emergent gameplay formulas. And there's nothing wrong with that, but short of a super deep dive into each character's storyline, it doesn't really leave us with much to talk about. There is one exception I want to cover, though. Lorenzo Calvino is the inventor of the looking glass technology you see throughout the ship. If you visit his room in the crew quarters, you can hear audio logs about his desire to build a looking glass visor that is implied to be based off of the Psychoscope that Morgan built. It's clear he's trying to take the looking glass technology to the next level, not just to present a 2D screen with a 3D scene behind it, but to use the Psychoscope to build an interactive virtual world. And in particular, Calvino aims to recreate his favorite memory of the love of his life. There's some interesting things to plumb here. VR is obviously encroaching in traditional game spaces, and that's sort of what's going on here. The return of the idea that these spaces are built more for the developer than for the player. The level editor UI on Calvino's computer that further cements the comparison between looking glass technology and games. None of this is really engaged with directly, but it's just nice to see the themes come back into the game, even if it's just for 1 or 2 rooms. Anyways, Calvino does, however briefly, catch a glimpse of his love.
But I swear, there was a moment I saw her again. The day we met on the Costa Amalfi. Her lemon sundress. My Clorinda.
But the real applications of his research don't get revealed until later. Which brings us to the end of the game. The good news is that the end of the game actually picks up again thematically. Suddenly, Prey is very interested in the idea of finding truth in fictive worlds. The bad news is that this is really the least interesting part of the game to actually play, and mostly fumbles crossing the finish line. To start with the most petty criticism, this is the least interesting bit of the game to play. At this point, you've seen pretty much every major sector of Talos 1, and each time you go back to Alex's office, convinced you are now finally basically at the end of the game, a new random threat or quest appears. The first time you visit his office, Alex is the antagonist, and he forces you to go back and scan some coral before giving you his self-destruct key, because having him sitting on a device that could have solved this problem from the get-go in minutes is a plot hole, so they plugged it with a short fetch quest. He couldn't kill the Typhon because nobody went and did this 5-minute thing. Okay. Then you go back and, the military have shown up. Now every room is infested with murder bots immune to half of your powers. Also, your friends are running out of oxygen. Also, the military guy's a jerk.
Your brother, he likes a microphone. A spotlight. He can't resist. Even though he's hiding. You are running around like a nervous rat.
Okay, so you've taken care of the guy with the murder bots. So now you go back to Alex and, the giant boss Typhon has appeared. Better go take care of the end of the game for real now by running off through the entire space station again. Retreading spaces you've already visited, but this time with an 11th hour antagonist, and then with a second 11th hour antagonist is just... It's not super great. It doesn't work. Momentum is killed, and it kind of feels like the end of Return of the King. This game feels like it has a lot of endings that are just prequels to another ending. Not helping things is that the actual ending is pretty badly fumbled. The video you get at the end is no longer than 60 seconds, regardless of your choice, and it just feels really abrupt. It then immediately smash cuts to a credit sequence with a painfully on-the-nose song with the lyrics of, "It's time to beat the mind game." Psychoshock. Worse still, we then cut to the real ending of Prey, which should not have been behind the 7 minutes of unskippable credits, because it turns out that the entire game was a simulation running on Looking Glass 3.5 technology, the visor that Calvino was working on, and that the Morgan you thought you were playing as is really a Typhon being infused with Morgan's memories. And making this a post-credits stinger is just... terrible. This is terrible. It's like putting the reveal of Rosebud in Citizen Kane, or that it was Earth all along on Planet of the Apes after 7 minutes of unskippable credits. It is literally the whole point of the work. It is not a teaser for the 0451 Avengers initiative. And combined with the rushed pre-credits ending cutscene and the least interesting bits of the game leading up to this, and yeah, the game just does not stick the landing super well. That said, I do like this post-credits cutscene. It more or less cements all the ideas kicked around in the intro, which is awesome. Prey is indeed a reflexive game referencing itself in a metatextual sense. Prey more or less draws a direct line between the tests run in the intro and the events on Talos 1. Both were in imaginary space, asking questions to determine some truth about the player by having them believe they were something they weren't. In the opening of the game, Morgan believed she was an astronaut in training when really she'd been in space for 3 years. And in the closing of the game, the Typhon-Morgan hybrid believed she was just a person. And this is where I think we reach the core ideas Prey really wants to explore. Namely, are the choices we as players make in virtual spaces as imaginary characters reflective in some way on our true identities?
In the end, he chose to activate the null-wave device. Why? To preserve the Typhon technology? We can't really know what its motives were for anything it did.
Is there such a thing as a true identity, or does putting on the mask of a player character change who we are in some way that their choices are not in some way our choices? Does our perception of reality help define who we are, or are we who we are innately ourselves, regardless of the reality we're presented with?
If someone had made you, then I suppose your truest self would be the one that fulfills whatever purpose your maker intended. I know who made me, and why. Did someone make you, Morgan? Were you made for something?
The game doesn't really have answers to those questions, and that's fine. Ambiguity isn't a bad thing. Prey just constantly toys with concepts that touch on these ideas of artificial identity. Mimics pretending that they're something else. January being a robot operator with a copy of Morgan's brain. Luca masquerading as Will Mitchell and then threatening to take your suit and become MU. The D&D campaign the crew was playing that gave us insight into what their characters were like. Calvino trying to recreate the woman he loved in a way that is fundamentally artificial. Even Alex, who is something of a tragic figure in this light, is just desperately trying to get his sister back. Once on Talos 1 when longing for the original Morgan after neuromod wiping changed her personality.
The tests, they changed you. Not a lot at first, but eventually, the constant stripping of your memory. I didn't know who you were anymore. All I want is to have my sister back so we can finish what we started.
And once again in the post-credit sequence when trying to turn a Typhon into her.
I need to know if you see us. I mean, really see us. Take my hand if you do. We're gonna shake things up, like old times.
Which of these artificial identities and fake realities contain a truth? And whose truth is it? The creator of the lie or the person who believes the lie? Who gets to decide what identities are or are not real, and who they are real or not real to? That's sort of what Prey wants you to guess at and think about. At the end of the day, though, most of the actual player choices boil down to the usual video game stuff. Do you kill the bad dude or do you just knock him out? Do you go on a genocide run, or do you play like a real human being? Do you save your friends who are running out of oxygen, or do you just neglect them to go exploring or build a gun or something? The only really thematically engaging choice is the final one, because it does sort of ask you to pick which of the two Morgans you see reflected back at you through the looking glass represent the real Morgan. Which identity do you choose to believe is yours? Is the real Morgan the original Morgan, the one who sides with her brother, the one who thinks the null-wave device should be used in order to preserve the work being done on Talos 1, the one who is pretty much okay with how neuromods are made with Russian prisoners?
What else?
Why are we making this video?
Right. Because my big brother is paranoid. Psychometric data is showing statistically significant variance in personality patterns between trial runs of the new neuromods. Whatever. I feel more like myself than ever.
Or is the real Morgan the Morgan who has gone through so many brain wipes she became paranoid and convinced herself that she needed to build a robot to help her carry out a suicide pact to kill everyone on the station in order to protect Earth?
But you've seen what those creatures can do. They're a part of you now. If even one cell gets back to Earth, we're lost. I'm sorry. I wish there was another way.
It's not a good ending, bad ending choice. It's a choice to embrace one identity and reject another. The game needed more choices like that, and fewer do he die or do he live video gamey decisions. In a game about finding real identities in pretend realities, we needed to be examining that stuff more, but the game's interest in replicating System Shock 2 and Bioshock rob it of an ability to focus on that stuff. Most of the game is combat, or solving problems with a goo gun in emergent and interesting ways, which is fun, but is not thematically relevant. Ultimately, I'm really torn on Prey. Thematically, I love it, but it only really engages with its themes in its opening and closing hours, and its closing hours leave a little bit to be desired. From a gameplay perspective, it's great, but it spends most of its time trying to recreate moments of 0451's past, rather than charging forward with a vision for the future. And those last few hours and the decision to put the big reveal after the credits really do just suck the wind out of the end of a playthrough. Still, I'm glad I played it, and I'm glad it exists. Even if it doesn't quite stick the landing all the way through, I think it poses some really great questions along the way, it plays like a great 0451 title, and honestly, it's worth it for those few opening hours alone. Anyway, coming up next, hopefully something very different.